Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. It's good to be back with you on this Friday. Hope you had a safe Labor Day holiday and an enjoyable one. Has this year just flown by, or is it just me? I mean, it seems like the older I get, the days, the weeks, the months just absolutely fly by. Well, I appreciate you joining me, and I have been sharing with you the challenge of Jesus. The challenge of Jesus is very powerful, very pertinent, and it will not go away. The challenge of Jesus, pardon me, is found in John chapter 10, 35 and following, where Jesus said, "If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works." Now this is an incredible challenge. In contradistinction to the other world religions, which do not honestly invite, challenge, inquiry, Jesus Christ himself urges us to look at his claims, and if he did not keep his word, he is not to be believed. In John chapter 5, Jesus said, "From henceforth," that's from this time onward, "the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment unto the Son, that all men might honor the Son as they honor the Father." Boy, if you think, what an incredible statement. The Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do, he will do likewise. Now, I hope that you get a little bit of a flavor of the power of this challenge. I've shared with you in previous programs how the Jews reject Jesus, and they reject him because they believe Jesus predicted he was coming to put an end to human history in the first century. Well, he didn't do that. Therefore, Jesus can't be the Son of God. He cannot be the Messiah. The Muslims, while on the one hand they claim to believe that Jesus was, quote, a prophet, they turn around and call him a failed prophet. Well, how can they call him a prophet of God, all the while saying he was a failed prophet? And he was a failed prophet, just like the Jews say, because he said his coming was going to be in the first century. It did not happen, therefore he lied. The atheists tell us the very same identical argument. They tell us it's obvious that Jesus predicted his coming to put an end to world history, end time, destroy the planet in the first century, but of course he didn't do it. Therefore, Jesus cannot be the Son of God. Now, I have asked you, the viewers, to consider, what will you do with the challenge of Jesus? And have you ever really seriously confronted this challenge? I've shared with you, and I want to reiterate this because it always made such a powerful impression on me. For some 19 years, my partner, William Bell, and I set up a booth at Abilene Christian University. And we handed out literature, we engaged in Bible studies. Now, we're talking about men who were deacons, elders, preachers, professors. As we would confront them with the challenge of Jesus, it was literally astounding to engage in conversations with so many of them that literally had no idea of the nature of the challenge of Jesus. Most of them had never been confronted by an atheist, a Jew, or a Muslim. When we asked them, how will you respond to the challenge of Jesus if you are confronted by a Muslim who says your Jesus is a failure? How will you answer that? How will you answer if you're confronted by, as we engaged with a lot of students, how will you respond to that challenge if you go to a secular university and there you are confronted by atheistic professors who say, if you believe in Jesus, you're just stupid? As I've had college students share with me, that's what they encountered in their secular university classes. And they didn't know how to respond. They had never been confronted with the challenge of Jesus. Now, let's be very clear, as I pointed out in my last program. Jesus unequivocally did predict that he was coming back in the first century. I've shared with you Matthew chapter 10, 23. He told his apostles to go preach the gospel and that they would be persecuted. When they were persecuted, they were to flee from city to city throughout the cities of Israel. And he said, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man is come. The apostles are not still alive, folks. The apostles are not still preaching in the land of Israel. They're not still fleeing from their persecutors. Well, that means that either Jesus came in their lifetime or he lied. Jesus said that he was going to come in the glory of the Father with his angels in the judgment of every man before all of the audience standing around him at that time died. Matthew 16, 27 and 28. Now, many people try to avoid the force of this passage, and they say, well, what you have to understand here is that the coming that Jesus promised there was fulfilled on the Mount of Transfiguration 7 days later. Well, I'm sorry, that won't work. Because after all, Jesus said, there are some standing here who will not die. Well, that means that the majority of them would die. And Mark's version, in Mark chapter 8, tells us there was a great multitude gathered around him. Are we supposed to believe that the majority of that great multitude died in just 7 days? You see, that doesn't work at all. Others try to divide Matthew 16, 27 and 28 and say, well, okay, verse 27, that's the end of time coming of the Lord. Verse 28, when Jesus said, verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's the day of Pentecost. Well, the problem with that is, as I've shared with you, verse 28 begins with the little Greek term, amin lego humin. And that little term is used 95 times in the New Testament. And it never breaks a subject. It never introduces a new subject. It is always a statement that is made to call attention to what is about to be said that will emphasize what has already been said. Did you catch that? Amin lego humin, translated as verily I say unto you, calls attention to what is about to be said that will emphasize what has just been said. Now that means that verse 28 is going to emphasize verse 27. And that means, therefore, that some standing there that day would not die until they saw Jesus coming with his angels in judgment. Do you see the challenge of Jesus? Boy, this is important. Now, I shared with you just a little bit in our last study together, just a little bit of what Jesus meant when he said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father. That statement is incredibly pregnant with meaning. Pardon me. I urged you at that time to go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and to find the book Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory. In that book, I do an in-depth examination and exegesis of Matthew 16, 27 and 28. And I explore the meaning of the term in the glory of the Father. I share that scholars have long recognized that what Jesus meant by that term was he was going to come like his Father had come. He was going to come in judgment as his Father had come in judgment. See, that's John 5, if you remember. From henceforth the Father judges no one. He has committed all judgment to the Son, so that all men might honor the Son as they honor the Father. The Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do, he will do likewise. So here we have John chapter 5, Matthew 16, both of which are telling us very clearly, very explicitly, very undeniably that Jesus' coming in judgment was to be his coming like the Father had come in the past. So the question is, how had the Father come in the past? Well, I shared with you Deuteronomy 33, 1 to 2. I hope you've read that passage. I shared with you Isaiah chapter 19. Behold, Yahweh rides on a swift cloud into Egypt. The river Nile would be dried up. All the fish in the river would die. The land would be desolate. Well, guess what? Chapter 20 of Isaiah, and you do understand that the Bible originally had no chapter divisions in it. Chapter 20 is explaining how this would take place, who would accomplish it. And it's talking about Sargon, the king of Assyria, who would send his general down into Egypt and invade Egypt and destroy them. And by the way, we know that was done. If memory serves me correctly, that's somewhere around 712 BC. I'll have to double check that date, but it's somewhere around there. So what's the point? Well, here's the Father riding a swift cloud into Egypt to destroy Egypt, and yet we are emphatically told it is the time when the Assyrians under King Sargon would invade Egypt and destroy her. Now, we might call this a providential judgment, a providential coming of the Lord. And what it means, very simply, is this. Yahweh would sit in the heavens, exalted and glorious. In his sovereignty, he would use the Assyrians to destroy the Egyptians. Now, make no mistake about it. The Egyptians did not believe that it was Yahweh in control. Now, I want to read to you a passage from Isaiah chapter 10. The Lord is going to use Assyria to destroy the 10 northern tribes of Israel, carry them off into captivity. Here's what the Lord said of Assyria. Woe to Assyria! Pay attention very carefully. The rod of my anger and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I will send him against an ungodly nation. Now he's predicting the fall again of the 10 northern tribes. All right? In this passage. The Lord says, I will send Assyria. Now watch this. Against the people of my wrath. I will give him charge to seize the spoil, to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire in the streets. Yet he does not mean so, nor does his heart think so. But it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off not a few nations. For he says, are not my princes altogether kings? Is not Kino like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad? Is not Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has found the kingdoms of the idols, whose carved images excel those of Samaria, of Jerusalem and Samaria, as I have done to Samaria and her idols, so shall I not do also to Jerusalem and her idols? You see, here is Assyria. She is ascribing her power and her victories, and notice the nations here. Kino, Carchemish, Hamath, Arpad, Damascus. They've already conquered these lands. And they're ascribing their victory to their gods. So they now turn to Samaria and the 10 northern tribes, and they say, hey, our gods have given us the victory over all these other lands. Who's to say our gods will not give us victory over Samaria and Israel? And oh, by the way, it's in our heart to destroy Jerusalem as well. Now, as we will see, that was in his heart, but he didn't get to do it. But the point is this. Look at the language once again. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I will send him. I suspect, had you gone to Sennacherib, who was the king of Assyria at this time, and if you would have said, do you realize that it is Yahweh who is using you to punish the 10 northern tribes of Israel? I suspect he would be like, absolutely nonsense. I worship Moloch. I worship Astarte. I worship Baal. They are the gods and the goddesses who give me the victory over all of these nations. And Yahweh said, no. You've got it all wrong. I am the one who has been giving you these victories. You may have destruction and death in your mind. That's okay. I'm going to use you to bring destruction on Samaria. You are the rod in my hand. You are the staff of my wrath that I have put in your hand. Now, by the way, we're going to find this identical language in Ezekiel chapter 30, when the Lord said, speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, I have put my sword in your hand. Only this time, it's the Babylonians, not the Assyrians, but the Babylonians that were going to destroy Egypt. Different period of time, but the same concept. You don't suppose for a moment, do you, that the Lord had a literal sword made in heaven that he was going to put into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar so that Nebuchadnezzar could have this magical heavenly sword? Oh, by the way, Adolf Hitler believed that. He believed in this mythical, magical sword of the Lord. Myth and fable. The Lord was speaking metaphorically. He had chosen, in Isaiah 10, he had chosen the Assyrians to accomplish his purposes. Having chosen the Assyrians, he sovereignly used the Assyrians to accomplish his purpose. Just like he would later choose the Babylonians and use the Babylonians to accomplish his purpose. Now, back to Isaiah 19. What was it called when the Lord, who had chosen Assyria, when he sent Assyria against Egypt, what was it called? It was called the Lord coming on the clouds of heaven. Do you catch that? This is absolutely critical. I had to get my computer to operate correctly there. Went into sleep mode for some reason. So do you see the power of this? The power of this is understanding Hebraic thought. The power of this is understanding, as I shared with you in our last get-together. It is so critical that you and I get out of our Grecian worldview, which tends to be more literalistic, and we get into the heart, the mind, and the literature of the ancient Hebrews. It was poetic. It was figurative. It was hyperbolic. God was expressing powerful language or powerful thought in word pictures, in mental pictures of Him acting in history. But no one would imagine, no one would have thought at the time that Yahweh was literally, visibly going to come out of heaven riding a cumulus cloud into Egypt and dry up the Nile River, killing all the fish, burning all the crops. No. This is common Hebraic apocalyptic. Apocalyptic language is sometimes called the language of de-creation. What do I mean by that? Well, it sounds like, if you take it absolutely literally, and once again, here's the problem. If you take the language literally, yes, it sounds like Yahweh would literally, visibly, and bodily come out of heaven. Well, if that would be so, then the Egyptians would see Him coming, right? And yet, Jesus said, no man has seen God. God is invisible. So we can't impose a literalistic worldview. We cannot impose a literalistic view of language on the text, since we have Jesus Himself saying, no man has seen God. No man has seen God. And then go to Isaiah chapter 19 and say, well, it says Jesus was going to ride a cloud into Egypt, therefore He either did or will. No. You see, that completely ignores Hebraic apocalyptic. And the figurative, metaphoric, highly exaggerated language of this kind of language. By the way, this kind of language is still somewhat recognized in the Middle East. Okay? And let me insert this thought as well. I'm not making this stuff up, okay? Some of the world's most profound New Testament scholars of the day, N.T. Wright, Scott McKnight, R.T. France, and on we could go, recognize that this language of coming on the clouds with fire, with a trumpet to destroy heaven and earth is Hebraic apocalyptic that was never ever intended to be taken literally. So I'm not making this stuff up on my own. I gleaned this from reading the Scripture. Then it was such a joy and a thrill to be able to read from world-class scholars that this is realized in the world of scholarship. It is, to say this as kindly as possible, it is truly naive on our part thinking that we as 21st century Americans can pick up the Bible and ignore the world in which it was written, the culture in which it was written, the worldview in which it was written, the type of language in which it was written, and automatically understand exactly what it meant. Well, Bible says what it means what it says. We've already talked about that. Well, that sounds good on the surface, but it is only appropriate and it is only accurate if you and I get into the scriptures. How do we understand it when Yahweh said, Assyria is the rod in my hand? He holds the staff of my anger that I've put in his hand. Not a literal rod, not a literal staff, but the Lord said, I am going to send him. You see, that's sovereignty. That's Yahweh operating in sovereignty to accomplish his will by using the Assyrian to destroy the Egyptian. If we don't understand the nature of apocalyptic, if we do not understand the figurative, metaphoric nature of this language, we are doomed, and I use that word advisedly, we are doomed to misunderstand Jesus' statement when he said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall judge every man. We will fail to see that Jesus, by the way, in passage after passage after passage, quotes from these Old Testament prophecies, prophecies that are demonstrably metaphoric. And if we read those verses from our literalistic Western Grecian worldview, we will be doomed to misunderstand them. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely what has happened in the history of Christianity. Now, next week, we're going to take a look at some other passages that demonstrate what it meant for Christ to come in the glory of the Father. I'll see you then.